Hello friends, Mrs. Tucker here. Okay, so for today's activity for ELA, I am going to read the story, They Really Are Giant. And this is the supporting story that goes along with our story, The Ugly Vegetables, which is Unit 2, Lesson 7 in our Journeys book. So I'm going to read through this story, and I'm going to compare this story to The Ugly Vegetables, talk about how they are the same, and I'm going to contrast this story with The Ugly Vegetables and talk about how the two stories are different. Okay? Now, this story is an informational text. It's an informational story, and we've read a bunch of informational stories already this year. We already know that informational stories give facts about a topic. Now, this happens to be a magazine article. So this was actually a story that was written in a magazine, and it's a true story because informational stories we already know are true stories. We already know we're going to see a lot of photographs because the author wants us to see real things. We're going to see headings in our stories, like what we have right here, to tell you what is on top or what you're going to be reading on those pages. And sometimes we're going to have captions or little words that go along with pictures too. Now in this story, we also have a bar graph. Now a bar graph is actually kind of a math thing, but you can have math things in your reading stories too. And a bar graph is a drawing that uses bars to compare numbers. So it uses bars to show information, to show how much of something there is, or how little of something there is. And we'll talk about that bar graph when we get to the end of the story. Now, if you wanted to look at your book, if you have your book at home and you wanted to look at your book, this is on pages 254 and 255 in your Journeys book. Otherwise, you can just follow along with me as I read it on the screen. This story is called They Really Are Giant by Judy Williams. To some farmers, plain, ordinary-sized vegetables seem boring. These farmers think big. They like to grow the biggest vegetables ever. I was reading this little caption right here next to the man. So this is kind of like an example of information that goes along with the picture. All right, here's our heading. World Record Breakers. Plants are always blooming in California. The scent of rich soil fills the air. Every year in Half Moon Bay, the town holds the World Championship Pumpkin Weigh-Off. The judges all nodded yes when they saw the 2007 winner. It weighed 1,524 pounds, more than a big horse. Pumpkins aren't the only giant veggies, though. Some farmers use their muscles and heavy shovels to dig up 30-pound beets and turnips. Although these giants look tough, they are tender and delicious to eat. Now, here is another caption that goes along with this picture. This is a picture of that gigantic pumpkin they're talking about, the 1,524-pound pumpkin. That's a huge pumpkin. And it says, Thad Starr won first place at the Half Moon Bay contest for his supersized pumpkin. This is a picture of Thad Starr, the winner of the supersized pumpkin contest. Wow, that is a huge pumpkin. All right, now on the next page, our heading says Home of the Giants. Alaska might be the home of giant veggies. More giant veggies seem to grow there than any other place in the world. Long summer days and good soil make veggies grow and grow. You can see 98-pound cabbages at the Alaska State Fair in Palmer. 7-year-old Brianna Dinkle from Wasilla, Alaska looks small next to this giant wrinkled leaf cabbage. So here's a picture of this girl, Brenna Dinkle, and she is actually standing next to a giant cabbage. So she's actually standing up. She's not sitting down next to the cabbage. She's standing up next to the cabbage, and that cabbage is pretty huge if it's compared to her. Now, here is our example of the bar graph. Now, a bar graph, again, is information that shows different numbers. We use them in math, but we can also use them in stories to share information. The title of this bar graph is How Big Are They? Your bar graph is always going to have a title so that you know what you're measuring. Now, along the side here, you have different weights. So it starts with 0 pounds. Bar graphs always start at the bottom. Starts with 0 pounds and goes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. So all the way up to 70 pounds. And across the bottom, we have the names of the different kinds of vegetables and people that we are measuring. So just to give you an idea of the biggest vegetables of certain kinds of vegetables there are, right here we have an example of a carrot. And so far, the biggest carrot that's ever been grown is 19 pounds. That's pretty big. That's bigger than a regular size cat. It's like the size of a small dog. Now, here's a cucumber. Maybe you've had a cucumber as a vegetable before, or a giant pickle, because cucumbers make pickles, or pickles are made out of cucumbers. The biggest cucumber that's ever been grown is 27 pounds. That's larger than that carrot. That's like two really big cats put together. A little bit smaller than Richie, though. He's only 40 pounds. But this red cabbage right here, another kind of vegetable, kind of like a lettuce, only a little bit thicker leaves, has a little bit different taste than lettuce. This red cabbage weighs 42 pounds. The biggest one that they've ever grown is 42 pounds. That's pretty big. That's a big cabbage. Not as big as this 98-pound one over here, though. But this is a different kind of cabbage. Now, this would be an example of an average second grader. Now, this is just average. You may weigh more than this second grader. You may weigh less than this second grader. And that does, because every person is different, and that doesn't really matter. But the average second grader is about 60 pounds. So, however, there's a radish, which is actually a really small vegetable, which is bigger than the average second grader. The biggest radish that was ever grown was 68 pounds. Now notice how in this case our weights go bigger and bigger. We have 19 pounds, 27 pounds, 42 pounds, 60 pounds, 68 pounds. So our weight increases each time with this graph. And you always have labels of what it is that you're measuring down at the bottom, as well as where they stop right here, because these didn't just stop right on the line. So they wanted to show you that, like, for example, the radish is 68 pounds. It didn't quite reach 70 pounds, so it stops right here a little bit before the line for 70, and they wrote that it was 68 pounds. Those are some pretty huge vegetables. Okay. So now let's talk about how our two stories are the same. The ugly vegetables and they really are giant. So let's think about them and compare them. How are they the same? Well, one way that they are the same, obviously, especially if you look at the pictures that you see right here on this page, is both stories obviously talk about vegetables, right? Now, in the ugly vegetables, she was talking about Chinese vegetables. And in this story, they're talking about pumpkins and cabbages and things like that. But the stories are both talking about vegetables. And in this part of the story, it was talking about how the vegetables can look tough, but they're not really tough. They're tender and delicious to eat. And remember, in the ugly vegetables, even though the vegetables were ugly and they weren't really nice looking and her mom had to work really hard to cut them up, they ended up being really, really delicious in the soup that her mom made. So that's one way that they are the same. Also, too, we're talking about people growing vegetables. It's another way that the two stories are the same. In this case, it's farmers growing vegetables. In the ugly vegetables, it's the girl and her mom growing vegetables. And then at the end of the story, the neighbors were growing vegetables too. Now let's talk about how are these stories different. I think these stories are a little bit more different than they are the same. Well, our ugly vegetable story is a realistic fiction story. So remember, that means that the story could really happen, but it's still fake. And that's because the author did not write the story honestly. She left out some parts of the story, like her sisters, which she should not have left out her sisters in the story, but she did. So she left out her sisters in the story. So that made it kind of fake, even though the story really did happen in her life. Plus, in the ugly vegetables, they're talking about people growing vegetables and growing flowers. And how they both grew, how everybody then grew both of those all together in their gardens at the end of the story. In this story, They Really Are Giant, it's an informational story. So this is all true, all facts. And this story is only talking about people growing vegetables, not talking about people growing flowers. Also, too, in this story, They Really Are Giant, we see those real photographs. And even though our story, The Ugly Vegetables, was a true story, we didn't have photographs. We just had drawings, illustrations. because the author wasn't able probably to show us the real thing. She just wrote a story about something that happened in her childhood. She probably didn't have real photographs of those things when they happened. Now, just like all informational text, this story, They Really Are Giant, has headings where our other story does not. There's words that go along with the pictures, some captions, some other text features. Plus, in this story, we have that added bar graph. In our ugly vegetable story, we don't have a bar graph to talk about how big the vegetables got or how big the flowers got or anything like that. So even though our stories are kind of the same, or they're having the same topic, they're talking about vegetables, the stories are both very different at the same time. So thank you for listening to this, and I hope you remember this later, and I hope to be able to see you soon. Bye, friends.